Sometimes life takes everything from you before it gives you a reason to start over. For 50-year-old Irving Brenner, that moment came when he and his grown son Wyatt moved into a mountain cabin with only a few $100s between them. Irving had once been a wilderness guide in these same mountains, back when life made sense. Those days felt like someone else's memories. One morning, he found a massive wild beehive on a cliffside he used to climb. Using old ropes and forgotten skills, he harvested jars of thick amber honey. That honey turned out to be rare and valuable. But could it do more than put food on the table? Could it heal what was broken between father and son? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled in the November air, the sound loud in the mountain silence. Irving Brenner sat behind the wheel, hands still gripping it though they'd been parked for 10 minutes. Beside him, his son Wyatt stared out the passenger window at the cabin that would be their home now. Neither of them had spoken since they'd turned off the main road 20 minutes ago. The cabin looked smaller than Irving remembered. Weathered logs, a sagging porch, windows that probably leaked when the wind picked up. His uncle's place, left to his father, passed to him in a will he'd barely read. He'd never thought he'd need it. "Well," Wyatt finally said. His voice was flat, carefully neutral. "Here we are." Irving released the steering wheel and opened his door. The mountain air hit him immediately, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of early snow. For a moment he was 25 again, leading tourists up trails, his wife Sarah waiting for him back in town, pregnant with the son who now sat beside him, wearing the same defeated expression Irving saw in the mirror every morning. They unloaded in silence. There wasn't much to unload. 2 duffel bags each, a box of kitchen supplies, another of bedding. Everything they owned fit in the truck bed with room to spare. 6 months ago, Irving had a 3-bedroom house in Denver, a steady warehouse job, a routine. Then the layoffs came. Then the mortgage payments he couldn't make. Then the conversations with Wyatt that always ended in silence or anger. The cabin's interior smelled of dust and disuse. Irving's uncle had died 3 years ago, and no one had been here since. One main room serving as kitchen and living area, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with pipes that groaned when he tested the faucet. The furniture was sparse, a worn couch, a wooden table with 3 mismatched chairs, a bed frame in each bedroom. The place had electricity but no internet, no television, no connection to the world they'd left behind. "Which room do you want?" Irving asked, setting his bags down. Wyatt shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Everything was "doesn't matter" with Wyatt these days. At 26, his son moved through life like a ghost, present but not really there. It had been that way since Sarah died 4 years ago. Cancer, swift and merciless. She'd been gone within 8 months of diagnosis, and neither Irving nor Wyatt had figured out how to live in the space she left behind. Irving took the smaller bedroom. While Wyatt unpacked, Irving explored the cabin more thoroughly. In the closet of his room, he found his old climbing harness hanging from a hook, the nylon webbing faded but still intact. He ran his fingers over it, remembering hands that were steadier, a body that was stronger, a man who knew who he was and what he was doing. That man felt like a stranger now. He'd been a wilderness guide for 8 years after college, leading groups through these mountains, teaching them to read the land, to move through it with respect. He'd loved it. The physical challenge, the solitude broken by brief human connection, the simple certainty of trail and summit. Then Sarah got pregnant, and responsibility had meant steady income, health insurance, a real career. So he'd moved to Denver, taken an office job that became a warehouse job that became unemployment. And now he was back, but nothing felt like coming home. It felt like retreat, like failure. Irving hung the harness back in the closet and closed the door. They spent the afternoon making the cabin livable, sweeping out months of dust, airing out musty bedding, checking that the ancient refrigerator still worked. Wyatt moved through the tasks mechanically, and Irving didn't push conversation. They tried talking in Denver after the eviction notice, after Irving suggested they move to the cabin. Wyatt had agreed because what else was there to do? He'd lost his own job, a coffee shop that closed during the pandemic, and never found another. He'd been living with Irving when everything fell apart, two men sharing space, but not really living together. Just existing, getting through days. As evening approached, Irving made dinner from the groceries they'd picked up in town, the last real town they'd see without a 45-minute drive. Pasta, jarred sauce, a bagged salad that was already wilting. They ate at the wooden table, the silence broken only by forks on plates. "The mountains are beautiful," Irving tried. "I'd forgotten how beautiful." Wyatt nodded, chewing. "There are trails all over. We could explore. I used to know every path within 20 miles. "Sure," Wyatt said, non-committal, polite. Irving set down his fork. "Wyatt, I know this isn't what you wanted." "It's not what I wanted either. But we're here, and we need to make it work." His son looked at him, then really looked at him, and Irving saw something flicker in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or disappointment, or just exhaustion. "I'm not blaming you, Dad," Wyatt said quietly. "I'm just tired. I'm tired of starting over. I'm tired of everything falling apart. I know. Do you?" Wyatt's voice carried an edge now. "Because sometimes I think you're so busy trying to fix things that you don't actually see what's broken." The words landed like stones. Irving wanted to respond, to defend himself, but what could he say? Wyatt was right. After Sarah died, Irving had thrown himself into work, into keeping busy, into anything that meant he didn't have to feel the gaping absence she'd left. And Wyatt had spiraled quietly, and Irving had let him because grief was easier to ignore than to face. "You're right," Irving said finally. "I'm sorry." Wyatt blinked, surprised. Then he nodded and returned to his food. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't anger either. It was something, a small crack in the wall between them. After dinner, Wyatt retreated to his room. Irving cleaned up, then stepped out onto the porch. The sun had set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The temperature was dropping fast. He could see his breath. The mountains rose around the cabin in layers, dark pines giving way to bare rock, peaks touched with early snow, glowing in the last light. This had been his world once. He'd known these ridges, these valleys, these cliffs. He'd moved through them with confidence, teaching others to do the same. That man seemed like a dream now, someone he'd invented. But standing here, breathing this air, feeling the familiar weight of altitude, something stirred. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the memory of what hope felt like. Inside, he could hear Wyatt moving around in his room. His son was in there alone with whatever thoughts haunted him, and Irving was out here alone with his own, and there was a wall between them built from 4 years of unspoken grief and accumulated failures. The money wouldn't last long. A few months maybe, if they were careful. He'd need to find work, though there wasn't much work in these mountains. They'd have to figure something out. They always did. Barely, but they did. Irving looked up at the emerging stars, so much brighter here than in the city, away from all the light pollution. He used to know the constellations, used to point them out to tour groups. Now he could barely remember their names. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd start walking the trails again, relearning the land. Maybe Wyatt would come with him. Maybe not. But Irving needed to move, needed to do something other than sit still with his thoughts. He went back inside, locked the door, checked that Wyatt's light was still on. Then he went to his room and lay on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the cabin settle around him, the mountains silent and vast beyond the thin walls. Sleep came slowly, filled with half-formed dreams of trails he used to know, and a life he used to live, and a wife who smiled at him from a distance he couldn't cross. Irving woke before dawn, an old habit from his guiding days. The cabin was cold, his breath visible in the dim light filtering through the window. He dressed quietly, pulling on layers, thermal shirt, fleece, the old waterproof jacket he'd found in the closet that still fit, barely. His hiking boots were in the truck, stiff from disuse but still solid. He made coffee in the ancient percolator, the sound loud in the morning silence. Wyatt's door stayed closed. Irving wrote a quick note, gone hiking back by noon, and left it on the table. Outside the world was grey and hushed. Frost clung to everything, turning the porch railing silver. Irving's breath plumed as he stretched, feeling his body protest. 50 years old, and he felt every one of them. But there was something else too, beneath the stiffness and the ache. Anticipation, maybe, or just the need to move. He knew where he was going. The Widow's Peak Trail, they'd called it. A rugged cliffside path that wound up through pine forest before breaking onto exposed rock face. He'd led groups up it dozens of times, always in summer, always with ropes and gear and careful preparation. It wasn't a technical climb, but it was steep, and the exposure was real. You had to respect it. The trailhead was a 10-minute drive down a dirt road that was worse than he remembered. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks, and Irving made a mental note, another expense they couldn't afford. Everything was an expense they couldn't afford. He parked in the small clearing that served as parking area. Empty, of course. November in the mountains meant solitude. The tourists were gone, the summer people back in their cities. Just him and the wilderness. The first mile was through dense pine forest, the trail carpeted in fallen needles that muffled his footsteps. Irving moved slowly, letting his body remember the rhythm. His legs burned, his lungs worked harder in the thin air, but it felt good. It felt like something. The trail steepened. His breath came harder now, white clouds in the cold air. He stopped to rest, hands on his knees, feeling his heart pound. Out of shape, dangerously out of shape. But he pressed on, stubborn. The pines thinned, and the trail broke onto open rock. This was the part he remembered. The narrow path carved into the cliff face, the drop-off to his right, the mountain rising sheer to his left. He moved carefully, testing each step, keeping his weight centered. The wind picked up here, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of snow from higher elevations. And then he saw it, tucked into a crevice in the rock face, about 20 feet above the trail and 15 feet out, an enormous wild beehive. Even from this distance he could see its size. 3 feet across, maybe more, the honeycomb visible where the rock didn't cover it. Dark amber dripped slowly down the stone, thick and viscous in the cold air. Irving stopped staring. He'd seen wild hives before, but nothing like this. This was old, established, massive. The bees would be dormant now in the November chill, clustered inside for warmth. But come spring, this colony would be powerful. He studied the approach. The rock face was rough granite, plenty of holes. Not a difficult climb by his old standards, but those standards were 25 years old. Still, the route was there. Up about 12 feet to a ledge, traverse right, then another 8 feet up to where the hive sat in its stone alcove. The smart thing would be to leave it alone. Wild bees, wild honey, wild mountains, none of his business. But something pulled at him. Maybe it was the sheer improbability of it, this gift hanging there in the rock. Maybe it was the memory of who he used to be, what he used to be capable of. Maybe it was just desperation, the knowledge that this honey, if it was as good as it looked, could be worth something. He stood there for a long time, weighing risk against reward, pride against caution. Then he turned and continued up the trail, pushing the hive from his mind, or trying to. The summit of Widow's Peak was a flat granite outcrop with views in every direction. Irving sat on a sun-warmed boulder, drinking water from his bottle, looking out at the sea of mountains, rolling away to distant horizons. This view had once filled him with peace. Now it just made him feel small. Sarah had loved these mountains. When they were first married, before Wyatt, they'd spent weekends up here. She'd hike with him, patient with his need to stop and identify plants, to read the landscape, to talk about geology and weather patterns and all the things that fascinated him. She'd listen with genuine interest, or maybe just genuine love. He'd never been sure which. After she died, he'd stopped coming. Couldn't bear the memories, the ghost of her beside him on every trail. Easier to stay in Denver, to work and come home and sleep and work again, to let the mountains fade into something that happened to someone else. But the mountains didn't fade. They waited. And now here he was, back where he started, trying to figure out how to live in the wreckage of the life he'd built. Irving finished his water and started back down. The hive was still there, of course, honey still dripping slowly down the rock face. He stopped again, studying it with a guide's eye. The approach was manageable. He had rope in the cabin, his old harness. He'd need protective clothing, thick jacket, gloves, maybe a makeshift veil. The bees would be sluggish in the cold, but not completely dormant. It would be dangerous, but not impossible. The question was whether he was still the man who could do impossible things. He continued down the trail, but the hive stayed with him. By the time he reached the truck, he'd made his decision. He'd come back tomorrow, properly equipped. He'd make the climb. Best case, he'd harvest some honey worth selling. Worst case, he'd fall and break his neck, and at least that would solve some problems. Dark thought. He pushed it away and drove back to the cabin. Wyatt was awake, sitting at the table with coffee and his phone, probably using the last of his data to check messages that didn't matter from people who didn't care. He looked up when Irving came in. "Good hike?" "Yeah," Irving said. Then, because something in him wanted to share it, wanted to test whether there was still connection possible between them, found something interesting. A wild beehive. Massive thing, tucked into the cliff face up on Widow's Peak. Wyatt's eyebrows rose slightly. Wild bees? Must be an old colony. The hive's huge. Irving poured himself coffee, his hands still cold from the hike. The honey looked incredible. Dark amber, really thick. You're thinking about harvesting it. Maybe would need to climb up to it. Not a hard climb, but not easy either. Wyatt set down his phone, actually looking at his father now. "When's the last time you climbed anything?" "Long time," Irving admitted. "But I remember how. Body might complain, but it remembers." His son studied him with an expression Irving couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or doubt. Then Wyatt said, "Would it be worth anything?" "The honey?" "Could be. Wild honey, especially from an established hive, can be valuable. People pay good money for it. And if the bees are feeding on the right flowers up here, alpine wildflowers, mountain herbs, could be something special." "How much money?" Irving shrugged. "Depends on the quality and how much I can harvest without damaging the colony. A few $100 maybe. Maybe more. A few $100. A drop in the ocean of what they needed, but more than they had now." Wyatt seemed to be doing the same math. Then he nodded slowly. "When are you going?" "Tomorrow, probably. Need to get my gear together, figure out the right approach. You should take someone with you." "For safety," Irving almost laughed. "Who?" "We don't know anyone here." "Take me!" The words hung in the air between them. Irving stared at his son, surprised. Wyatt hadn't volunteered for anything in months, hadn't shown interest in anything beyond his phone screen and whatever internal world he inhabited. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," Wyatt interrupted. "But you're talking about climbing a cliff face alone to rob a beehive. That's stupid without backup. I'll hold the rope or whatever you need." It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't even warmth. But it was engagement, and that was something. That was more than Irving had gotten from his son in years. "Okay," Irving said. "Tomorrow morning, then. We'll need to get some supplies in town first. Protective gear, containers for the honey." Wyatt nodded and returned to his phone, but something had shifted. Some small door had opened. Irving felt it, fragile and tentative, and was afraid to acknowledge it too directly, afraid it would close again. He spent the rest of the day organizing his old climbing gear, testing the rope, checking the harness for wear. Everything was old but serviceable. He'd need better gloves, something thick enough to protect against stings. And they'd need jars, good sealing jars for the honey. That night, over a simple dinner of soup and bread, they made a list. Wyatt added items Irving hadn't thought of: a smoker or at least material to make smoke, antiseptic for stings, extra rope for redundancy. His son had clearly been thinking about it, researching on his phone. "You've been reading up on beekeeping?" Irving asked. "Just basic stuff. How to approach a hive, what makes bees aggressive, how to harvest without destroying the colony." "That's good, smart." Wyatt shrugged, but Irving caught the hint of a smile. Pride, carefully hidden but there nonetheless. After dinner, they sat on the porch together, something they hadn't done since arriving. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. Irving pointed out constellations he'd relearned from memory: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. Wyatt listened, and if he wasn't interested, at least he didn't leave. "Your mother loved these mountains," Irving said quietly. "We used to hike up here all the time before you were born." Wyatt was silent for a moment. Then, "I remember she talked about it sometimes, said she missed it. We should have come back." Should have brought you up here. Why didn't you? Life got busy. Work, bills, all the regular excuses. Irving paused. And after she got sick, I couldn't face it. Too many memories. Yeah, Wyatt said softly. I get that. They sat in silence, but it was different than before. Shared rather than separate. Two men sitting with the same grief, finally acknowledging it existed between them. Eventually the cold drove them inside. Irving lay in bed, listening to the cabin settle, thinking about the hive waiting up on that cliff face. It was just honey, just bees, just a risky climb for a few $100s they desperately needed. But it felt like more. It felt like a test of his body, his skills, his ability to still do something difficult and worthwhile. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like the beginning of something. He couldn't name what, not yet. But for the first time in months, he fell asleep with something other than dread pooling in his chest. Tomorrow they'd climb. Tomorrow they'd see what the mountains had to offer, and whether he was still capable of accepting the gift. They left early, the truck's heater struggling against the morning cold. The drive to town took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads, and neither of them spoke much. Irving focused on driving, while Wyatt scrolled through his phone, occasionally reading aloud facts about bee behavior and honey harvesting. The town, Pine Ridge, population 2,400, was the kind of place that looked better in summer. November stripped away any charm, leaving just the functional bones, a main street with a hardware store, a grocery, a diner, a gas station. They parked outside the hardware store. Inside, an older man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. "Help you folks? Need some supplies," Irving said. "Heavy-duty gloves, mason jars, and whatever you've got for making smoke. Thinking about harvesting some wild honey." The man's expression shifted, became guarded. "Wild honey, huh? Whereabout?" "Up near Widow's Peak. Found a hive yesterday." "That's so." The man set down his newspaper. "You might want to check with Carl Dutton before you go messing with any hives around here. He's the local beekeeper, has arrangements with most of the wild colonies in these mountains." Irving felt something tighten in his chest. "Arrangements? They're wild bees." "Sure, but Carl's been working this territory for 30 years. He knows where every hive is, manages them sustainable-like. Wouldn't want to step on any toes." "The hive's on public land," Wyatt said quietly. "That's legal, right?" The man shrugged. "Legal, maybe. Polite, that's another question. But it's your choice. Gloves are in aisle 3, jars are in back." They gathered what they needed in silence. Irving could feel the weight of the man's disapproval, or maybe just his warning. This Carl Dutton, of course there'd be someone with a claim, real or imagined. There was always someone. At the register, the man rang them up without comment. The total made Irving wince. $73 for supplies to maybe make a few hundred. The math only worked if the honey was as good as it looked. "Appreciate the warning," Irving said as he paid. "Just being neighborly. Carl's a good man, but he's protective of his business. Can't blame him for that." They loaded the supplies in the truck. Wyatt broke the silence first. "You want to find this Dutton guy?" "Ask permission." Irving sat behind the wheel, not starting the engine yet. Part of him wanted to do exactly that. Be polite, be careful, avoid conflict. That was who he'd become in Denver. A man who kept his head down, who didn't make waves, who let life push him around because fighting back took energy he didn't have. But another part, the part that used to guide tourists up dangerous trails, that used to make decisions and stand by them, that part was tired of retreating. "No," he said finally. "The hive's on public land. We're not doing anything wrong. If this Dutton has a problem, he can talk to us about it. We'll be reasonable. But I'm not asking permission to use public resources." Wyatt looked at him with something that might have been respect. "Okay, let's do it then." They drove back to the cabin, unloaded the supplies, and prepared for the climb. Irving pulled on his old harness, testing the buckles, adjusting the fit around a waist that was both thicker and somehow less substantial than it used to be. He coiled the rope, checked the carabiners, went through the mental checklist he'd run 1,000 times before. Wyatt watched, absorbing the process. "You really think this is safe?" "Safe enough." "The climb itself isn't technical. The bees are the wild card, but in this cold they should be sluggish. We'll use smoke to keep them calm, work fast, take only what we can carry easily. And if something goes wrong? Irving met his son's eyes. Then you get help. There's emergency services in Pine Ridge and cell service on the ridge above the trail. You'll have the keys. Don't try to be a hero. That's supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to be honest. They loaded the truck again and drove to the trailhead. The hike up was harder with the extra weight of supplies. Irving's legs burned, his breathing came harsh. Wyatt stayed close behind, not complaining but not offering conversation either. Both of them were saving energy for what came next. When they reached the section of trail below the hive, Irving stopped and studied the rock face in daylight. The hive was exactly where he remembered, the honeycomb dark and glistening. No bee activity visible, too cold. They'd be clustered inside, conserving warmth. "I'm going to set up the rope first," Irving said. "Anchor it to that rock outcrop above, then rappel down to the hive from there. You'll stay here, manage the belay, and take the containers when I fill them." Wyatt nodded, his face pale but determined. The climb to the anchor point was straightforward, a scramble up broken rock, using hands and feet, the old movements coming back despite his body's protests. At the top, Irving secured the rope around a massive boulder, tested it with his full weight, then tossed the line down to where Wyatt waited. "Ready?" he called. "Ready." Irving leaned back into the harness, felt the rope take his weight, and began to descend. The rock face was rough against his gloved hands. Wind tugged at him cold and insistent. He moved carefully, controlling his descent, trying not to think about how long it had been since he'd done this. The hive loomed larger as he approached. He could see the intricate structure of the comb now, the cells packed with honey and covered with a thin layer of dormant bees. Beautiful and dangerous. He lit the smoke material, dried leaves and pine needles in a tin can, and let the smoke drift toward the hive entrance. The bees stirred but didn't swarm. Good. He waited, letting the smoke do its work, calming them, masking the alarm pheromones. Then, moving slowly, he reached into the hive. The honeycomb broke away in heavy chunks, dense with amber honey. Irving worked carefully, filling the first container, sealing it, lowering it on a separate line to Wyatt. The bees crawled over his gloves, sluggish but present. A few stung through the fabric, sharp pain that made him flinch, but not stop. He filled a second container, then a third. The hive was so large he could take this much without seriously damaging it. The colony would survive, would rebuild, would be here for next season if he chose to return. A fourth container. His arms ached from holding position, from working carefully in an awkward angle with nothing but rope and harness between him and a long fall. But the honey kept coming, thick and perfect, better than anything he'd imagined. "That's enough," he called down to Wyatt. "I'm coming up." The ascent was harder than the descent. His muscles shook with fatigue, and the stings on his hands were starting to swell. But he made it to the anchor point, hauled himself over the edge, and lay on the rock for a moment, breathing hard. "Dad, you okay?" "Yeah, give me a minute." When he could move again, he broke down the anchor, coiled the rope, and made his way back down to the trail. Wyatt was standing guard over 4 sealed containers of honey, his expression caught between worry and excitement. "Let me see," Wyatt said, reaching for Irving's hands. The gloves came off to reveal 6 stings, the skin around them already red and swollen. Wyatt pulled out the antiseptic they'd bought, cleaning each sting with careful attention that made Irving's throat tight. "I'm fine," Irving said. "I know, but let me do this anyway." When Wyatt was satisfied, they opened one of the containers. The honey inside was unlike anything either of them had seen. Dark amber, almost brown, with a complex aroma that spoke of wildflowers and mountain herbs, and something else, something indefinable. Wyatt dipped a finger in, tasted it. His eyes widened. "Dad, this is incredible." Irving tasted it too. Rich, complex, with layers of flavor that unfolded on the tongue. Not just sweet but floral, herbal with a faint smokiness and a finish that lingered. This wasn't just honey. This was something rare. "We need to sell this," Wyatt said. "People will pay good money for this." "Maybe. Let's get it home first." The hike back was slow, both of them carrying 2 heavy containers each. But there was an energy between them now, an excitement that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with accomplishment. They'd done something difficult together. They'd succeeded. At the cabin, they set the containers on the table and stared at them. 4 half-gallon jars of honey that had been hanging on a cliff face yesterday morning. Irving's hands throbbed, his body ached, but he felt more alive than he had in years. "So what now?" Wyatt asked. "Now we figure out what this is worth," Irving said. "And then we figure out how to sell it." Wyatt pulled out his phone, already searching. Irving made coffee, watching his son work with a focus he hadn't seen in months. And for the first time since Sarah died, since everything fell apart, Irving felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but the earned hope of someone who'd climbed toward something difficult and come back with proof that effort still mattered, that skill still had value, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward after all. Wyatt spent the evening researching while Irving soaked his swollen hands in cold water. The stings were painful, but manageable, a small price for what they'd harvested. Every few minutes, Wyatt would read something aloud from his phone. Facts about raw honey, articles about rare wildflower varieties, forum posts from honey enthusiasts willing to pay premium prices for unique harvests. "There's a farmer's market in Pine Ridge," Wyatt said. "Every Saturday. We could set up a booth, see if anyone's interested." Irving dried his hands carefully. "The hardware store guy mentioned that beekeeper, Dutton. He probably sells there." "So, we're not doing anything wrong." "No, but we're new. He's established. People might not want to rock the boat." Wyatt looked up from his phone, and Irving saw a flash of the old determination his son used to have before grief and failure wore it down. "Then we'll just have to make sure our honey speaks for itself." They spent Friday preparing. Wyatt designed simple labels on his phone. Mountain wildflower honey, small batch, raw and unfiltered, and printed them at the library in town. Irving cleaned and filled smaller jars, 8 ounces each, leaving the half-gallon containers as backup. They had enough for maybe 20 jars if they were conservative. Wyatt suggested pricing at $15 per jar. Irving thought it was too high, but his son pulled up comparisons. Artisan honey from smaller operations sold for $12 to $20 routinely. "We're not just selling honey," Wyatt explained. "We're selling a story. Wild harvest, mountain flowers, father and son operation. People pay for that." Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. They loaded the truck with their modest inventory, 20 jars of honey, a folding table Wyatt found in the cabin's shed, and a hand-painted sign Wyatt had made that read, "Wild Mountain Honey." It wasn't professional, but it was honest. The farmer's market occupied a parking lot behind the grocery store. A dozen vendors were already setting up. Vegetables, baked goods, handmade crafts, and at the far end, a large professional booth with Dutton's golden apiaries emblazoned on a banner. They chose a spot near the entrance, as far from Dutton's booth as possible. Irving set up the table while Wyatt arranged the jars in neat rows. Their display looked small and amateur next to the established vendors, but the honey itself, that dark amber gleaming in the morning light, that looked professional enough. People started arriving around 9. Most walked past with polite nods, heading for the familiar vendors they'd been visiting for years. Irving tried not to feel discouraged. Wyatt stood behind the table, trying to look confident, but Irving could see the tension in his shoulders. Then an elderly woman stopped. She had silver hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, assessing eyes. She picked up a jar, held it to the light, studied the dark color. "Wild harvest?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Irving said. "From a hive up near Widow's Peak. Harvested it myself Thursday." Widow's Peak. She unscrewed the lid, sniffed deeply. "May I?" Irving handed her a small wooden sample stick. She dipped it, tasted carefully, her expression neutral. Then her eyebrows rose. "Well now," she said quietly. "This is something." She tasted again, more thoughtfully. "Alpine wildflowers, mountain sage, and am I tasting bee balm? That's rare at this elevation." "I'm not sure," Irving admitted. "I know the area, but not the specific plants. This is exceptional honey, young man." "How much?" $15. She didn't hesitate. "I'll take 3 jars." As Irving wrapped them, she added, "You're new here. I'm Dorothy Keene. I've lived in these mountains for 70 years, and I know good honey. Carl Dutton's is fine for everyday use, but this is special." She paid, took her jars, and walked away. Irving and Wyatt exchanged glances, not quite believing it. Then Dorothy did something unexpected. She stopped at a cluster of women examining vegetables and held up one of the jars. Irving couldn't hear what she said, but 3 of the women immediately headed toward their booth. By 10 o'clock they'd sold 8 jars. By 11:15, people kept coming, drawn by word of mouth spreading through the market. Each customer tasted, reacted with surprise, and bought. Some bought multiple jars. Irving noticed Carl Dutton watching from his booth. A heavy-set man in his 60s with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. His sales seemed slower than usual, people drifting past to see what the new vendors were offering. Just after noon, Dutton walked over. Up close, he was imposing, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from decades of beekeeping. "You the ones harvesting up near Widow's Peak?" His voice was flat, controlled. "That's right," Irving said. "Irving Brenner. This is my son, Wyatt." Dutton didn't offer his hand.
"Carl Dutton."
"I've been managing the bee populations in these mountains for 30 years. That includes the wild hives. It's a delicate ecosystem. Can't have people just taking what they want without understanding the impact. We were careful," Wyatt said. "Only took what the colony could spare." "That's so? You have experience with wild bees? Know how to assess colony health? Understand seasonal impacts?" "I was a wilderness guide for 8 years," Irving said, keeping his voice level. "I respect these mountains and everything in them. We didn't harm the hive, maybe not intentionally, but wild honey is part of my business model. I monitor those hives, ensure they stay healthy, market them as part of my operation. When outsiders come in and start harvesting, it disrupts everything." A small crowd had gathered, other vendors and customers watching the confrontation. Irving felt heat rising in his chest, embarrassment, anger, the old instinct to back down and avoid conflict. But Wyatt spoke before he could. "With respect, Mr. Dutton, the hives are on public land. We're not required to ask permission." Dutton's eyes hardened. "No, legally you're not. But there are other considerations. Community, tradition, making a living. I'd suggest you think carefully before you harvest again." He walked away, and the crowd dispersed. Irving's hands were shaking, adrenaline or anger or both. But when he looked at their table, only 2 jars remained. "We're almost sold out," Wyatt said quietly. They sold the last 2 jars within 20 minutes. As they packed up, several customers asked when they'd be back, whether they could place orders. Wyatt collected names and phone numbers, promising to be in touch. The restaurant owner Dorothy had mentioned, a woman named Patricia who ran the Main Street Bistro, stopped by just as they were loading the truck. "Sorry I missed you," she said. "Dorothy Keene called me. Said I needed to try your honey. Any chance you have more?" "Not with us," Irving said, "but we have some at home. Could you bring me a few jars? I'm interested in featuring local products, and if it's as good as Dorothy says, I'd like to use it in some dishes. Maybe even retail it at the restaurant." They agreed to deliver on Monday. As they drove home, neither of them spoke, both processing what had happened. They'd made over $300. They'd created demand. They'd also made an enemy. At the cabin, Wyatt counted the money twice, spreading the bills on the table. "We need more honey. If Patricia wants to carry it, if people want to order, we need more product." "There are other hives," Irving said slowly. "I know this area. There are places I could check, remote spots where colonies might have established. Then we should look, tomorrow." Irving studied his son. Wyatt's face was animated in a way it hadn't been in years. Purpose, Irving realized. They'd found purpose, and it was bringing his son back to life. "Okay," Irving said. "Tomorrow we'll scout locations. See what's out there." That evening they sat on the porch despite the cold, both of them energized by the day. Wyatt talked about marketing strategies, about building a website, about the possibility of this becoming something real. Irving listened, watching his son come alive, and felt something shift deep in his chest. This wasn't just about honey. It was about reclaiming something they'd both lost: confidence, direction, connection. The mountains were giving them a second chance, and for the first time, Irving believed they might be worthy of it. "Your mother would be proud of you," Irving said quietly. Wyatt was silent for a moment. "Then she'd be proud of both of us, and maybe," Irving thought, "she would be. Maybe this was what she'd wanted all along, for them to find their way back to each other, to find purpose in the wreckage. Maybe the honey was just the excuse, and the real gift was sitting right here, a father and son, finally on the same side again." Wyatt spent the evening researching while Irving soaked his swollen hands in cold water. The stings were painful but manageable, a small price for what they'd harvested. Every few minutes, Wyatt would read something aloud from his phone. Facts about raw honey, articles about rare wildflower varieties, forum posts from honey enthusiasts willing to pay premium prices for unique harvests. "There's a farmer's market in Pine Ridge," Wyatt said. "Every Saturday. We could set up a booth, see if anyone's interested." Irving dried his hands carefully. "The hardware store guy mentioned that beekeeper, Dutton. He probably sells there. So, we're not doing anything wrong." "No, but we're new. He's established. People might not want to rock the boat." Wyatt looked up from his phone, and Irving saw a flash of the old determination his son used to have before grief and failure wore it down. "Then we'll just have to make sure our honey speaks for itself." They spent Friday preparing. Wyatt designed simple labels on his phone: mountain wildflower honey, small batch, raw and unfiltered, and printed them at the library in town. Irving cleaned and filled smaller jars, 8 ounces each, leaving the half-gallon containers as backup. They had enough for maybe 20 jars if they were conservative. Wyatt suggested pricing at $15 per jar. Irving thought it was too high, but his son pulled up comparisons. Artisan honey from smaller operations sold for $12 to $20 routinely. "We're not just selling honey," Wyatt explained. "We're selling a story. Wild harvest, mountain flowers, father and son operation. People pay for that." Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. They loaded the truck with their modest inventory: 20 jars of honey, a folding table Wyatt found in the cabin's shed, and a hand-painted sign Wyatt had made that read, "Wild Mountain Honey." It wasn't professional, but it was honest. The farmer's market occupied a parking lot behind the grocery store. A dozen vendors were already setting up: vegetables, baked goods, handmade crafts, and at the far end, a large professional booth with Dutton's Golden Apiaries emblazoned on a banner. They chose a spot near the entrance, as far from Dutton's booth as possible. Irving set up the table, while Wyatt arranged the jars in neat rows. Their display looked small and amateur next to the established vendors, but the honey itself, that dark amber gleaming in the morning light, that looked professional enough. People started arriving around 9. Most walked past with polite nods, heading for the familiar vendors they'd been visiting for years. Irving tried not to feel discouraged. Wyatt stood behind the table trying to look confident, but Irving could see the tension in his shoulders. Then an elderly woman stopped. She had silver hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, assessing eyes. She picked up a jar, held it to the light, studied the dark color. "Wild harvest?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Irving said. "From a hive up near Widow's Peak. Harvested it myself Thursday." Widow's Peak. She unscrewed the lid, sniffed deeply. "May I?" Irving handed her a small wooden sample stick. She dipped it, tasted carefully, her expression neutral. Then her eyebrows rose. "Well now," she said quietly, "this is something." She tasted again, more thoughtfully. "Alpine wildflowers, mountain sage, and am I tasting bee balm?" "That's rare at this elevation." "I'm not sure," Irving admitted. "I know the area, but not the specific plants." "This is exceptional honey, young man." "How much?" $15. She didn't hesitate. "I'll take 3 jars. As Irving wrapped them, she added, "You're new here." "I'm Dorothy Keene. I've lived in these mountains for 70 years, and I know good honey. Carl Dutton's is fine for everyday use, but this is special." She paid, took her jars, and walked away. Irving and Wyatt exchanged glances, not quite believing it. Then Dorothy did something unexpected. She stopped at a cluster of women examining vegetables and held up one of the jars. Irving couldn't hear what she said, but 3 of the women immediately headed toward their booth. By 10 o'clock, they'd sold 8 jars. By 11:15, People kept coming, drawn by word of mouth spreading through the market. Each customer tasted, reacted with surprise, and bought. Some bought multiple jars. Irving noticed Carl Dutton watching from his booth. A heavy-set man in his 60s, with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. His sales seemed slower than usual, people drifting past to see what the new vendors were offering. Just after noon, Dutton walked over. Up close, he was imposing, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from decades of beekeeping. "You the ones harvesting up near Widow's Peak?" His voice was flat, controlled. "That's right," Irving said. "Irving Brenner. This is my son Wyatt." Dutton didn't offer his hand. "Carl Dutton. I've been managing the bee populations in these mountains for 30 years. That includes the wild hives. It's a delicate ecosystem. Can't have people just taking what they want without understanding the impact." "We were careful," Wyatt said. "Only took what the colony could spare." "That's so? You have experience with wild bees? Know how to assess colony health? Understand seasonal impacts?" "I was a wilderness guide for 8 years," Irving said, keeping his voice level. "I respect these mountains and everything in them. We didn't harm the hive. Maybe not intentionally, but wild honey is part of my business model. I monitor those hives, ensure they stay healthy, market them as part of my operation. When outsiders come in and start harvesting, it disrupts everything." A small crowd had gathered, other vendors and customers watching the confrontation. Irving felt heat rising in his chest. Embarrassment, anger, the old instinct to back down and avoid conflict. But Wyatt spoke before he could. "With respect, Mr. Dutton, the hives are on public land. We're not required to ask permission." Dutton's eyes hardened. "No, legally you're not. But there are other considerations. Community, tradition, making a living. I'd suggest you think carefully before you harvest again." He walked away, and the crowd dispersed. Irving's hands were shaking, adrenaline or anger or both. But when he looked at their table, only 2 jars remained. "We're almost sold out," Wyatt said quietly. They sold the last 2 jars within 20 minutes. As they packed up, several customers asked when they'd be back, whether they could place orders. Wyatt collected names and phone numbers, promising to be in touch. The restaurant owner Dorothy had mentioned, a woman named Patricia who ran the Main Street Bistro, stopped by just as they were loading the truck. "Sorry I missed you," she said. "Dorothy Keene called me. Said I needed to try your honey. Any chance you have more?" "Not with us," Irving said, "but we have some at home. Could you bring me a few jars? I'm interested in featuring local products, and if it's as good as Dorothy says, I'd like to use it in some dishes. Maybe even retail it at the restaurant." They agreed to deliver on Monday. As they drove home, neither of them spoke, both processing what had happened. They'd made over $300. They'd created demand. They'd also made an enemy. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Irving hadn't known he was capable of anymore. Morning hikes with Wyatt, scouting locations where wild hives might be established. They found 2 more, one near Eagle's Rest, smaller but accessible, and another high on Granite Ridge, difficult but promising. Each harvest was careful, respectful, taking only what the colonies could spare. Irving started keeping a journal. A leather-bound notebook he'd found in the cabin, empty pages waiting to be filled. He documented each hive's location, the surrounding plant life, the color and consistency of the honey bloom cycles, weather patterns. The act of writing felt like reclaiming part of himself, the guide who'd once taught others to read the land, to understand the intricate relationships between altitude and ecology and season. Wyatt handled the business side. He'd set up social media accounts, posted photos of the honey against mountain backdrops, told their story in short, honest posts. Orders started coming in, not a flood, but steady. More than they could fill immediately, which was a good problem to have. They paid off the overdue electric bill, bought proper cold weather gear, fixed the truck's alignment. Small victories, but they added up to something Irving hadn't felt in years: stability. The farmers' market became routine. Every Saturday the same spot, their inventory growing as they harvested more. Dorothy Keene became their unofficial ambassador, bringing friends to taste the honey, spreading word through her network of long-time residents. Patricia featured it at the bistro, and customers started asking where they could buy more. But success brought attention Irving didn't want. One morning in early December, they received a message through their website. A food critic from a regional magazine wanted to visit, do a story on their operation. Wyatt was excited. Irving was nervous. What if she asks questions we can't answer? Irving said, "We're not professional beekeepers. We're just what?" Wyatt interrupted. "Just two people doing honest work?" That's exactly what makes it a good story. They spent 3 days preparing, cleaning the cabin, organizing their harvest schedule, practicing how to explain their methods. Wyatt made coffee runs to town, nervous energy needing an outlet. Irving reread his journal, making sure his notes were clear and accurate. The critic was scheduled to arrive on Thursday afternoon, but Wednesday morning everything changed. They hiked up to the Eagle's Rest Hive for a planned harvest. The trail was familiar now, Irving's body stronger from weeks of regular climbing. They reached the site and immediately knew something was wrong. The hive was destroyed, not by animals. The damage was too deliberate. Someone had torn into the honeycomb, scattered it across the rocks, left the colony exposed and vulnerable. Bees crawled sluggishly through the wreckage, doomed by the approaching winter. The whole site was marked with spray paint. "Stay out." Irving stood frozen, staring at the destruction. Beside him, Wyatt's breathing had gone sharp and angry. "Dutton," Wyatt said. "It had to be. We don't know that. Who else? He warned us. He said there would be consequences." Irving wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. They'd taken business from Dutton. They'd ignored his territorial claims. And now someone had destroyed their hive in a way meant to send a message. "We need to report this," Irving said. "Take pictures, document everything, call the rangers. And then what? They investigate, maybe talk to Dutton, and nothing happens. Meanwhile, we've lost a hive, and he knows he can get away with it. What do you want to do, Wyatt?" "Confront him. Escalate this into something worse." His son's face was flushed, jaw tight. "I want to stand up for ourselves. I'm tired of backing down." "You always back down, Dad, always, even when you know you're right." The words hit like a physical blow. Irving opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that caution wasn't cowardice, that protecting what little they had meant avoiding fights they couldn't win. But Wyatt kept talking. "After Mom died, you just disappeared. You were there physically, but you checked out. And when things got hard in Denver, when we started losing everything, you just accepted it. Like you didn't deserve to fight for anything. That's not fair, isn't it? We came here because we had nowhere else to go. And even now, even when we've built something good, you're ready to walk away the first time someone pushes back." Irving felt anger rising, hot and defensive. "I'm trying to protect us." "Protect you? I've already failed at that enough. You didn't fail, Mom. Cancer failed her. Life failed her. But you're failing me now if you won't stand up for what we've built." They stood in silence, the destroyed hive between them, years of unspoken resentment suddenly visible. Irving wanted to explain about the weight of grief, about learning that fighting back often meant losing more, about the slow erosion of confidence that came from watching everything you built crumble despite your best efforts. But maybe Wyatt was right. Maybe his caution had become cowardice. Maybe his grief had become an excuse. "Okay," Irving said quietly. "We document this. We report it. And then we decide together how to handle it. Not me making decisions for both of us. Together." Wyatt nodded, some of the anger draining from his face. They spent an hour photographing the damage from every angle, collecting evidence. Then they hiked down and drove to the ranger station in Pine Ridge. The ranger who took their report was sympathetic, but not optimistic. "Without witnesses or direct evidence, there's not much we can do. I can talk to Mr. Dutton, but unless he admits to something or you can prove he was involved, so he just gets away with it," Wyatt said flatly. "I didn't say that. I said it's difficult to prosecute. But I'll make a formal report, and if there are more incidents, we'll have a pattern documented." They left feeling frustrated and helpless. Back at the cabin, they sat at the table, the destroyed hive photographs spread between them. "The critic comes tomorrow," Wyatt said. "What do we tell her?" "The truth. That we're dealing with some local resistance. That someone vandalized one of our hives. That makes us look weak, like we can't protect our own operation. Irving studied his son. Or it makes us look honest, like people with integrity dealing with intimidation, which is exactly what we are. That evening, Irving took his usual walk to the porch, but this time Wyatt joined him. They sat in the cold, watching stars emerge over the mountains. "I'm sorry," Wyatt said, "for what I said about you checking out after Mom died. You weren't wrong. Maybe not, but I wasn't exactly present either. We both disappeared into our own grief." Irving nodded. "Your mother would know what to do right now. She always did. She'd tell you to stop apologizing and start fighting." Wyatt's voice was soft but certain. "She'd say you didn't come all this way just to let someone bully you into quitting. She would say that, wouldn't she?" They sat in silence, and Irving felt something shift, not a solution, but a shared resolve. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Not Irving protecting Wyatt, not Wyatt pushing Irving, but both of them standing side by side. The critic would come tomorrow. They'd tell their story, including the hard parts, and then they'd figure out how to deal with Carl Dutton in a way that didn't compromise who they were trying to become. The critic arrived at noon, driving a Subaru with city plates and carrying a professional camera. Her name was Jennifer Cho, mid-30s, dressed practically in hiking boots and a down jacket. She shook their hands with genuine warmth. "Thanks for having me. I've been hearing interesting things about your operation." They gave her the tour, the cabin, their small processing area, the maps Irving had marked with hive locations. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions, took notes, photographed everything. She seemed particularly interested in Irving's journal, flipping through pages of detailed observations. "This is impressive documentation," she said. "Most small producers don't keep records like this. Old habit from my guiding days," Irving explained. "Teaching people to read the land meant understanding it first." Over coffee at the cabin table, they told their story. Irving kept it honest, the job loss, the move, the discovery of the first hive. Wyatt talked about learning the business side, about building something from nothing. And when Jennifer asked about challenges, Irving didn't hesitate. "We've faced some local resistance. There's an established beekeeper who sees us as competition. Earlier this week, one of our hives was vandalized." Jennifer's pen stopped moving. "Vandalized? How?" Irving showed her the photographs. Her expression darkened as she studied them. "Have you reported this?" "To the rangers, yes. But without proof of who did it, there's not much they can do. Do you think it was this other beekeeper?" "We don't have evidence," Wyatt said carefully. "But he's made it clear he doesn't want us operating here." Jennifer set down her coffee cup. "That's a significant part of your story. Small operation facing intimidation, still persisting. That's compelling." They walked her up to the Widow's Peak hive, the original, still intact. Irving demonstrated their harvesting technique, explaining how they assessed colony health, how they took only what wouldn't harm the bees' winter survival. Jennifer photographed everything, asked questions about sustainable practices, about the relationship between wild bees and ecosystem health. At the hive, she tasted honey directly from the comb. Her reaction was immediate and genuine. "I've tasted a lot of honey for articles," she said. "This is extraordinary. The complexity. It's unlike anything commercial. Every location produces different flavors," Wyatt explained. "Different elevations, different plant varieties. We're basically documenting a map of the mountain's ecosystem through honey." Jennifer smiled. "That's a great angle. I'm definitely using that." She stayed for 3 hours, filling a notebook with observations. Before she left, she took a photograph of Irving and Wyatt standing together on the cabin porch, mountains rising behind them. "When will the article run?" Wyatt asked. "Next month's issue. But I'll post a preview online next week. You should see some traffic from it." After she drove away, Irving and Wyatt stood in the driveway, processing what had happened. "She didn't seem worried about the vandalism," Wyatt said. "She seemed interested. Public attention might be the best protection we have," Irving replied. "Harder for Dutton to intimidate us if people are watching." That Saturday at the market, Irving noticed the difference immediately. More people recognized them, mentioned they'd seen the online preview of Jennifer's article. Sales were brisk. But Dutton's booth was noticeably quieter, his expression darker each time Irving glanced over. Near closing time, Dutton approached again. This time his attorney was with him, a thin man in an expensive coat who looked out of place at a farmer's market. "Mr. Brenner," the attorney said, "I'm Richard Sutcliffe, representing Carl Dutton. My client would like to discuss a concern." Irving's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What concern?" "The hives you've been harvesting from are on traditional grounds my client has maintained for decades. While the land is technically public, there are customary use agreements that predate your arrival. We'd like to formalize a cease and desist arrangement." "You mean you want us to stop?" Wyatt said. "We'd prefer to resolve this amicably," Sutcliffe continued, "but Mr. Dutton is prepared to pursue legal remedies if necessary." Irving felt the old instinct rising. Apologize, back down, avoid the fight. But then he thought about the destroyed hive, about Wyatt's words on the mountain, about Sarah who would have told him to stand his ground. "We're not doing anything illegal," Irving said quietly. "We're harvesting sustainably from public land. If Mr. Dutton has specific concerns about our practices, we're happy to discuss them. But we're not going to stop because it's inconvenient for his business." Dutton's face reddened. "You come into my territory, take my customers, destroy my reputation with some magazine article." "We didn't destroy anything," Wyatt interrupted. "Unlike whoever destroyed our hive. I don't know what you're talking about. Eagle's Rest, 3 days ago. Someone tore apart our hive and spray-painted a warning. You wouldn't know anything about that?" Sutcliffe put a hand on Dutton's arm. "My client has no knowledge of any vandalism. These accusations are baseless. Then you won't mind if the Rangers investigate further," Irving said. "We've documented everything thoroughly." They stared at each other, the market crowd watching with interest. Finally, Sutcliffe handed Irving a business card. "You'll be hearing from us," he said. They walked away. Irving's hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, the aftermath of standing firm instead of retreating. "You okay?" Wyatt asked quietly. Yeah. That evening, 3 other vendors from the market stopped by the cabin. A woman who sold organic vegetables, a man with handmade pottery, another who produced goat cheese. They sat around Irving's table, and the vegetable seller spoke first. "We wanted you to know, Dutton's pulled this before. Different vendors, different products. He's got connections, uses intimidation to maintain control. Most people eventually leave rather than fight. Why hasn't anyone stood up to him?" Wyatt asked. The pottery maker shrugged. "Fear, mostly. He's powerful in this community. But what you're doing, going public, documenting everything, not backing down, that matters. You're not just fighting for yourselves." They talked for an hour, sharing stories of Dutton's tactics, discussing strategies for supporting each other. By the time they left, Irving felt something he hadn't expected: solidarity. They weren't alone in this. Late that night, Irving sat on the porch with his journal, adding new entries. But tonight, he also wrote about the day, the critic's visit, the confrontation, the unexpected allies. He wrote about fear and courage, about the difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself in caution. Wyatt came out, handed him coffee. "You think Dutton will actually sue?" "Maybe. Or maybe he's hoping the threat is enough. And if he does..." Irving looked at his son. "Then we deal with it together. We've come too far to quit now." Wyatt nodded, satisfied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. The mountains stood eternal around them, having witnessed this same pattern countless times. People struggling over territory, over pride, over survival. The mountains didn't care who won. They just waited, patient and permanent, while human conflicts played out in their shadows. But tonight, sitting with his son, Irving felt like maybe, just maybe, they were on the right side of this particular struggle. Not because they'd win, but because they were fighting for something that mattered. Something honest and earned and worth defending. The legal letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by certified mail. Irving signed for it with a sinking feeling, already knowing what it would say. Wyatt read it over his shoulder, his face darkening with each paragraph. Cease and desist. Claims of interference with established business operations. trespassing on traditional harvesting grounds, demands that they halt all honey production immediately. The alternative, a lawsuit for damages that would cost more than they'd made in 2 months. "This is garbage," Wyatt said, pacing the cabin. "Traditional grounds? They're public lands. He has no legal claim." "Legal doesn't matter if we can't afford an attorney," Irving said quietly. "That's what he's counting on. We either stop or we drown in legal fees we don't have." Wyatt threw the letter on the table. "So we just give up? Sell the cabin and leave? Run away again?" "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" Irving didn't have an answer. The weight of it pressed down on him. The impossibility of fighting someone with resources and connections they couldn't match. They'd been fools to think this could work, to think they could build something lasting from a few jars of honey and good intentions. "Maybe we should talk to someone," Irving said. "See if there are options we're not seeing. The library in town has legal resources or what? Free legal advice that tells us what we already know. That we're screwed." They spent the rest of the day in tense silence, each retreating to opposite ends of the cabin. Irving tried to think through scenarios, but every path led to the same conclusion. They couldn't afford this fight. That evening, needing to clear his head, Irving decided to go through more of the cabin's storage. There had to be something they could sell, some way to raise money for legal help. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes his uncle had left behind. Most of it was junk. Old clothes, broken equipment, outdated magazines. But in the far corner, under a section of loose floorboards, he discovered while checking for leaks, Irving found a metal strongbox. It was rusted, the lock corroded. Irving carried it downstairs, where Wyatt looked up from his phone with mild interest. "What's that?" "Found it hidden in the attic, under the floorboards." They pried open the lock with a screwdriver. Inside were papers, old, yellowed, some water-damaged, but most still legible. Irving pulled them out carefully, spreading them on the table. Property deeds, survey maps, legal documents dating back to the 1950s. "What is all this?" Wyatt asked, leaning closer. Irving's hands trembled as he read. His uncle's name, Horace Kincaid. His father's name as heir. And finally, his own name, inherited when his father died 5 years ago. He'd received notification of the cabin, but he'd never looked deeper, never questioned what else came with it. The property wasn't just the cabin. It was 217 acres of surrounding mountainside. Mineral rights, timber rights, and crucially, harvest rights for all natural resources. "Dad," Wyatt said, his voice strange, "do you know what this means?" Irving pulled out a survey map, comparing it to the topographical map they'd been using to mark hive locations. His heart was pounding now, hands unsteady as he traced boundaries. The Widow's Peak Hive, on their property. Eagle's Rest, on their property. Even Granite Ridge, barely, fell within the boundaries. "He's been harvesting on our land," Irving said slowly. "Dutton, for years. He's been operating on property we own." Wyatt grabbed the survey documents, reading them carefully. "These are legitimate? Legally recorded? They're dated and stamped by the county. Look, recording numbers, official seals. This is real." They sat in stunned silence, the implications unfolding. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Dutton wasn't the established operator protecting his territory. He was the trespasser. "Why didn't your father tell you?" Wyatt asked. Irving thought back to those last conversations with his father, the man he'd barely known after years of distance created by pride and stubbornness. His father had mentioned the cabin, said it was there if Irving ever needed it. But he'd never mentioned the land, never explained what he was really leaving behind. "He wanted me to find my own way," Irving said slowly, understanding dawning. "He didn't want me to rely on inheritance. He wanted," his voice caught, "he wanted me to come back on my own terms, to discover what was here when I was ready. That's a hell of a gamble. He knew me, knew I'd never accept help directly. But this, finding it when we needed it most, this is different." Wyatt was already on his phone, searching for contact information. "We need to verify this, get it officially confirmed, and then we need to decide what to do with it," Irving finished. They spent the next day in Pine Ridge, at the county recorder's office. A clerk helped them trace the property history, confirming everything in the strongbox. The land was legally Irving's, properly recorded, taxes paid current through an automatic account Irving's father had set up years ago. "You're lucky you found these," the clerk said. "Most people don't realize what they own until there's a problem. With property this size, you'll want to get it surveyed again. Update the boundaries with GPS coordinates." Irving thought of someone. There was a woman at the market, a widow who sold preserves. Someone mentioned she used to be a surveyor. Her name was Helen Garvey, and when Irving called her, she remembered them immediately. "The honey vendors?" she said warmly. "I bought 3 jars from you. Best honey I've tasted in years." Irving explained the situation, the discovered deed, the need for professional confirmation, the conflict with Dutton. Helen was quiet for a moment. "Carl Dutton has operated like he owns these mountains for too long," she said finally. "I'd be happy to help, no charge. Consider it my contribution to shaking things up around here." She came to the cabin that afternoon, examined the documents, and nodded with satisfaction. "These are solid. I can do a complete survey, document everything with modern GPS, make it ironclad. Give me a week." Over the next few days, Helen worked the property, while Irving and Wyatt watched their business continue to grow despite the legal threat. More orders came in. Jennifer's full article published and phone calls increased. Each success felt bittersweet, knowing it might all disappear if they couldn't resolve the situation with Dutton. But now they had leverage. The question was what to do with it. "We could destroy him," Wyatt said one evening. "Sue for trespassing, for all the years he's been using our land without permission. Take everything." Irving thought about it. The temptation was there. Revenge for the intimidation, for the destroyed hive, for the fear they'd lived with. But he also thought about his father, about the gift that had been left for him. Not wealth for its own sake, but resources to build something meaningful. "We could," Irving said slowly. "Or we could be better than that." "Better how?" "We could offer him terms. Let him continue operating, but fairly. Recognize that we both have a place here. Show him that we're not interested in destruction, just in being treated with respect." Wyatt studied his father. "That's generous. After everything he's done, it's strategic. And it's right. We didn't come here to be like him. We came here to build something good." Helen finished the survey and delivered her report. Every hive location, every boundary line, everything documented with professional precision. Irving held the papers and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. Tomorrow, they'd meet with Dutton and his attorney, and they'd find out if the man could accept mercy or if he'd push this to destruction. Irving spent the morning before the meeting, reviewing every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence they'd assembled. Helen's survey report was comprehensive. Maps marked with GPS coordinates, boundary lines clearly defined, a professional assessment that would stand up in any court. Wyatt made coffee and watched his father work. "You nervous?" "Terrified," Irving admitted. "This either ends today or it gets much worse. We have everything we need. The deed, the survey, proof he's been operating on our land. We hold all the cards. That's what worries me. Power can corrupt as easily as desperation." They'd arranged to meet at Sutcliffe's office at 2. Irving dressed carefully, not trying to impress, but wanting to feel like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. Wyatt wore the same button-down shirt he'd worn to his mother's funeral, and Irving had to look away from the memory. Helen offered to come as their expert witness, and they accepted gratefully. She arrived at the cabin at 1, carrying a leather portfolio with duplicate copies of everything. "You ready for this?" she asked. "No," Irving said honestly. "But we're doing it anyway." The drive to town felt longer than usual. Helen followed in her own truck. None of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts about what came next. Sutcliffe's office was above the bank, a small suite that tried too hard to look prestigious. A receptionist showed them to a conference room, where Dutton and his attorney were already waiting. Dutton looked tired, Irving noticed. Older than he had at the market, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Sutcliffe was composed, professional, a legal pad filled with notes in front of him. "Thank you for coming," Sutcliffe began. "We're hoping to resolve this matter without—" "Before we start," Irving interrupted quietly, "I'd like to introduce Helen Garvey. She's a licensed surveyor and has prepared a report we think you'll want to see." He slid the property deed across the table. Dutton picked it up, his expression confused. Then as he read, confusion shifted to disbelief. "What is this?" "Property deed for the land surrounding my cabin. 217 acres. It includes most of the areas we've been harvesting from." Sutcliffe took the deed, read it carefully, his professional composure slipping. "This has been verified?" Helen placed her survey report on the table. "Completely. I've documented every boundary with GPS coordinates, cross-referenced with county records. It's all legitimate." Dutton's face had gone pale. "You're saying—" "I'm saying the land you've been operating on for 30 years belongs to me," Irving said. "You've been trespassing, harvesting resources from private property without permission." Silence filled the room. Sutcliffe was reading the survey report now, his expression increasingly grim. Dutton sat frozen, the reality settling over him like a weight. "You didn't know," Irving said, making it a statement rather than a question. "The land, it's always been public, open range. I've been working these mountains since before you were born. My uncle owned it. My father inherited it. Now it's mine. None of that changes the fact that you've been operating without authorization." Sutcliffe set down the report. "Mr. Brenner, what exactly are you proposing?" This was the moment. Irving could crush Dutton, could demand compensation for years of trespass, could drive him out of business entirely. The temptation was there. Revenge for the intimidation, for the destroyed hive, for weeks of fear and uncertainty. But he thought about Sarah, about the man she'd loved. He thought about his father's gift, given not for wealth but for purpose. He thought about Wyatt watching, learning what kind of man his father truly was. "I'm proposing a partnership," Irving said. "An agreement that allows both of us to operate. You continue harvesting, but with formal permission. A percentage of your harvest comes to me as the landowner. Standard arrangement. No exclusivity, no intimidation of other producers. Fair market practices for everyone." Dutton stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "You could destroy me, because destroying people isn't why I came here. I came here to build something with my son, to create something good, and I'd rather do that alongside you than by stepping on your neck. After everything I've done, the threats, the lawyers, after everything you've done." Irving agreed. "I'm still offering this." Sutcliffe looked between them, professional instinct warring with surprise. "Mr. Dutton would need to review any agreement carefully." "Of course. Take your time. But understand, this offer has an expiration. If you'd rather fight this in court, we're prepared for that too. Helen's report is comprehensive. The vandalism is documented. We have witnesses to your threats. It won't go well for you." Dutton's hands were shaking. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse and rebuild itself simultaneously. "I need to think," he said hoarsely. "Fair enough. You have until Monday. After that, we proceed however we need to." They stood to leave. At the door, Irving turned back. "Mr. Dutton, I understand protecting what you've built. I understand fear of losing everything. I've been there. But there's enough mountain for both of us, if you're willing to share it." Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and cold. Irving's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Helen gave him a quick hug. "That was brave," she said. "And kind. I'm not sure he deserved either. Maybe not. But I did. I needed to know I could win without becoming something I'd hate." They drove back to the cabin in silence. When they arrived, Wyatt made tea and they sat at the table, processing what had happened. "You think he'll accept?" Wyatt asked. "I don't know. Pride can make people do stupid things. But I think he will eventually. The alternative is losing everything. And if he doesn't, then we go to court and we win. But I'd rather not. I'd rather spend my energy building something than tearing someone else down." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Mom would have been proud." "Of how you handled that." "I hope so. I tried to think about what she'd want, not just what I could get away with." That evening, they sat on the porch as usual, but this time Irving felt different. Lighter, he'd been given power and chosen mercy. He'd faced the man who'd threatened them and offered partnership instead of destruction. Whether Dutton accepted or not, Irving had proven something to himself about who he wanted to be. The mountains stood eternal around them, patient witnesses to human drama. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But tonight, Irving Brenner sat with his son and felt something he hadn't felt in years, pride in the man he was becoming. 3 days passed in tense waiting. Irving and Wyatt continued their routine, hiking, harvesting, filling orders, but everything felt suspended, like holding a breath. Monday came and went without word from Dutton or his attorney. Tuesday morning, Sutcliffe called. Mr. Dutton would like to meet. Not at my office, he suggested the cabin. Tomorrow at 10, if that works. It works, Irving said. He hung up and looked at Wyatt, who'd been listening from across the table. Tomorrow. He's coming here. That's a good sign, right? Coming to us instead of making us go to him. Maybe, or maybe he wants to see the property firsthand. Confirm we're telling the truth. They spent Tuesday afternoon cleaning the cabin, organizing their operation to look as professional as possible. Irving laid out his journal, the harvest records, photos of each hive, showing their careful, sustainable methods. Evidence of responsibility, of respect for the land and the bees. Wednesday morning arrived cold and bright. Irving made coffee, too nervous to eat breakfast. Wyatt paced the porch, watching the road. At exactly 10 o'clock, Dutton's truck appeared, grinding up the dirt road. He came alone. No attorney, no witnesses. Just an older man climbing out of his vehicle with careful, stiff movements. Up close, away from the confrontation and the market, he looked smaller, more human. Irving stepped off the porch. Thanks for coming. Dutton nodded, his expression unreadable. Wanted to see the place. Wanted to see if you were serious. About the partnership? Completely serious. Show me the boundaries. They walked the property line closest to the cabin, Irving pointing out landmarks, while Helen's survey map served as reference. Dutton asked questions. About the deed's provenance. About Irving's father and uncle. About how long the property had been in the family. Your Uncle Horace, Dutton said finally. I knew him. Not well, but I knew him. Quiet man! Never mentioned he owned all this land. He was private. My father, too. They didn't believe in making a show of things. Unlike me, Dutton said with bitter humor. I've been making a show for 30 years. Telling everyone these were my mountains, my territory. He shook his head. All on land I didn't own. They stood looking out at the peaks, the vast expanse of wilderness that cared nothing for human ownership or pride. After a long silence, Dutton spoke again. I vandalized your hive. At Eagle's Rest, I was angry, scared. Thought I could intimidate you into leaving. He met Irving's eyes. I'm not proud of it. Irving felt something loosen in his chest. I appreciate you admitting it. I also spread rumors in town. Told people you were reckless, that you were damaging the ecosystem. None of it was true. Your methods are sound, better than mine in some ways. Why are you telling me this? Because if we're going to work together, it needs to be honest. No more games, no more threats. I'm too old and too tired to keep fighting battles I've already lost. They walked back to the cabin, where Wyatt waited with coffee. The three of them sat at the table, the survey documents spread between them. I've talked to my attorney, Dutton said. He thinks I'm a fool to accept your terms. Says I should fight, claim adverse possession, drag this out for years. Irving's stomach tightened. And I told him I'm done fighting. You're offering me something I don't deserve. A chance to keep working, to maintain my business, to stay in these mountains. I'm not stupid enough to refuse. He pulled papers from his jacket, a formal agreement drafted by Sutcliffe based on Irving's proposal. 20% of my harvest from your property, no exclusivity, fair market practices. And I help monitor hive health, share my knowledge. That seem fair? Irving read through the agreement carefully. It was more generous than he'd expected. Dutton was offering expertise, mentorship, a genuine partnership rather than just grudging compliance. One addition, Irving said. The agreement includes a clause about community cooperation. Neither of us interferes with other small producers. We support fair competition. Dutton hesitated, then nodded. Fair enough. Though that'll hurt my business. It'll make the whole market stronger. And that helps everyone eventually. They signed the papers, Helen serving as witness. When it was done, Dutton sat back, looking exhausted but also relieved. "I need to apologize to your son," he said, turning to Wyatt. "The things I said at the market, the threats, that was wrong. You were protecting your father and standing up for what was right. I respect that." Wyatt accepted the apology with grace beyond his years. "We all do things we regret when we're scared." After Dutton left, Irving and Wyatt sat in silence. The confrontation they'd been building toward, the climax they'd expected, it had happened, but not the way they'd imagined. There was no dramatic showdown, no crushing victory, just two men finding a way forward that allowed both of them dignity. "That was anticlimactic," Wyatt said finally. "Real life often is, but it's better this way. Better for everyone." Helen stopped by that afternoon with the final survey documents, everything officially recorded with the county. She stayed for coffee, and Irving noticed the way she looked at the cabin, at the view, at him. "You've built something good here," she said. "Against long odds. We had help. Your survey made all the difference. The survey was just paper. You made the difference. You could have destroyed Dutton, but you chose mercy instead. That takes character." After she left, Wyatt gave Irving a knowing look. "She likes you. We just met. Dad, she surveyed your property for free, showed up as your witness, and just complimented your character. She likes you." Irving felt heat rise in his face. "Your mother would want you to be happy, would want you to keep living. It's been 4 years. You're allowed." Irving thought about Helen, her competence, her kindness, the easy way she'd fit into their crisis. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd shared, about the years of grief that had defined him since her death. Maybe Wyatt was right. Maybe it was time to start thinking about living instead of just surviving. But that was a question for another day. Today, they'd won without destroying anyone. Today, they'd proven they could stand firm while staying true to who they wanted to be. Spring turned to summer, and the mountains came fully alive. The hives thrived, producing honey in quantities Irving had only hoped for during those desperate early days. But the measure of success had changed. It wasn't about the money anymore, though that came steadily enough. It wasn't even about the business, though it grew beyond their initial dreams. It was about the 3 young people who showed up in May, eager to learn. The apprenticeship program Irving and Wyatt had discussed became real, teaching sustainable harvesting, wilderness skills, respect for the ecosystem. Irving found himself guiding again, but differently than before. Not leading tourists through pretty scenery, but mentoring people who wanted to build lives in these mountains. On a warm June morning, Irving led the apprentices up to the original hive at Widow's Peak, the same trail he'd climbed alone that first desperate day, looking for anything that might save them. Now he climbed with purpose, with students, with knowledge to share. "The bees don't owe us anything," he told them at the cliff face. "We're guests here. We take only what they can spare, and we're grateful for that. The moment you forget that, you've stopped being a harvester and become a thief." One apprentice, a young woman named Sage, who reminded him of Sarah in her fierce attention to detail, asked the question he'd been waiting for. "How do you know when you've taken too much?" "You listen, you watch. You learn to read what the colony is telling you. And when you're not sure, you take less. Always err on the side of the bees." They harvested together, Irving supervising while the apprentices did the work. Their movements were careful, respectful, exactly as he'd taught them. Pride swelled in his chest, not just for what they were learning, but for what he was capable of teaching. Back at the cabin that evening, Wyatt had dinner ready. He'd become the better cook, taking over kitchen duties while Irving handled the wilderness work. Helen arrived with fresh bread from town, and they sat around the table that had once held only silence and grief, now filled with conversation and laughter. "The Hendersons want to place a standing order," Wyatt reported. 50 jars a month. "And that couple from Denver, the ones who visited in April, they bought property 2 ridges over. They're serious about making it work." "Good for them," Irving said. "We should help however we can. Already offered. I'm meeting them next week to share what we've learned. After dinner, Irving pulled out his journal, thicker now, filled with months of observations. Wyatt had been encouraging him to do something more with it, and tonight he finally made the decision. "I'm going to write a book," Irving said. "A guide to wild honey harvesting, sustainable practices, ecosystem management, everything we've learned. So others don't have to figure it all out from scratch." Helen smiled. "That's perfect. You're a natural teacher. I'll help with the business sections," Wyatt offered. "Marketing, building a customer base, all that. And I'll handle the technical drawings," Helen added. "Maps, diagrams, property considerations." Irving looked around the table at these two people who'd become his family. Wyatt, transformed from the hollow young man he'd been into someone with purpose and confidence. Helen, who'd brought warmth and companionship back into his life without demanding he forget what came before. Later on the porch, his thinking place, his refuge, Irving sat alone for a few minutes. This ritual hadn't changed, but its meaning had. It was no longer about hiding from the day or dreading tomorrow. It was about gratitude, reflection, peace. He thought about Sarah, not with the sharp pain of those first years, but with gentle fondness. She'd been part of his journey, essential to who he'd become. Her death had broken him, but the breaking had been necessary. The old Irving, comfortable, complacent, going through the motions, needed to shatter so this version could emerge. "Thank you," he whispered to her memory. "For everything. For Wyatt, for teaching me what matters. I'm okay now." "We're okay." Wyatt joined him, 2 cups of tea in hand. They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies emerge in the meadow below the cabin. "I've been thinking," Wyatt said, "about starting a foundation, using some of the profits to help people like we were, people who've lost everything and need a chance to rebuild. Maybe grants for equipment, or land access, or training." Irving looked at his son with wonder. "That's ambitious. We've been given a lot. Seems right to pass it on. Your mother would love that idea." "I know," Wyatt smiled. "That's why I thought of it." They sat quietly, father and son, no longer separated by grief, but joined by purpose. The mountains stood eternal around them, having witnessed their transformation from broken refugees to builders, teachers, stewards. Irving thought about that first morning, finding the hive. He'd been looking for survival, a few dollars to keep them afloat. Instead, he'd found salvation. Not in the honey itself, but in what the search for it had required. Courage, persistence, partnership, faith that broken things could be made whole. The honey had been extraordinary, rare, valuable. But the real treasure had always been the journey. The slow rebuilding of trust between father and son. The discovery that starting over wasn't failure but courage. The understanding that purpose could be found even in the darkest valleys if you were willing to keep climbing. Helen appeared in the doorway. "You two planning to sit out here all night?" "Just a few more minutes," Irving said, and she nodded, understanding. When they finally went inside, Irving paused at the threshold and looked back. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars, patient and permanent. They'd been here long before him and would remain long after. But for this brief moment, they were home. He closed the door softly, sealing in warmth and light and the sound of people he loved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new harvests, new opportunities to teach and build and grow. But tonight, he simply rested in the knowledge that he'd found his way back. Not to who he'd been, but to who he was meant to become. Sometimes the sweetest things in life came from the hardest places. And sometimes, when everything was stripped away, what remained was enough to build a future worth living.